Welcome to the Grifter Lab podcast, where we use science and science-based tools for everyday learning. In today's podcast episode, we are going to be ranking self-improvement slash podcasts that can better your life, or maybe just entertaining podcasts. Maybe in today's video, it's just podcasts. Maybe that's it. Maybe no self-improvement, just podcasts. We're going to go on and we're going to start out with the Huberman Lab podcast. We're going to start out strong and we're going to start out swinging straight from the go. We're going to start out straight from the go. We're going to start out with a goated podcast. I think this podcast is a really, really good podcast. I think you can learn a lot from this podcast, learn about a lot your life, a lot about your body, a lot about yourself in this podcast. I think this is the better, one of the better science podcasts out there. I think he explains it in a way that's not too difficult. I'm not going to lie, he does use some words like norepinephrine, dopamine fasting, gooning for 24 hours a day, that are pretty complicated, pretty hard to understand for the most people, but still, overall, it's pretty good. You're going to learn a lot from this podcast. Great guest. Guests are really smart also, but I prefer, even though he has some great guests, I do prefer the ones where he just talks about, he has a structured thing, a structured protocol for you to follow and for you to better your life. And it's based on science, which is great. Great. Thank you, Stanford University, for birthing this man, for giving this man. Thank you very much. Goat, S tier. The Christian George Janko podcast used to be a impulsive guy, used to hang around with Logan Paul, fool around in that area. I really like George Janko. I think he's great. I think it's a decent podcast. I think it's still a relatively young podcast. What is it, like 2 years old? These other guys have been mainstays for 10 years. This is my theory. This is my grand theory. Once eventually Joe Rogan, eventually Lex Fridman, eventually, Andrew Huberman are going to pass along, are going to fade away. I think George Janko could really have the big opportunity to be there and to become a mainstay. I really think he should focus on this grind, focus on becoming a good podcaster, and I think he'll become a real mainstay. I think it'll be a great podcast for the days going on. He got to ask better questions. He got to improve a little bit. But I think the trajectory, the stock, is going well. I think it's going to go really well. I really hope he keeps his grind. I hope he doesn't fucking leave the podcast like he did with the Logan Paul podcast. And I really hope he sticks to this one. I think it's going to be great. Modern Wisdom, another goated podcast. I think this one is pretty good. I was going to put it in A tier. I think I'm going to put it in S tier, or I'm going to put it at the very, very tip top. It's in between the top of A tier and the top of S tier. I think this guy, you know how Andrew Huberman sort of makes stuff, science-based things to improve your life? I think this guy is just how to improve your life, and he asks questions about that to everybody. When he has Matthew McConaughey on, he's not asking about his acting skills and shit like that. He's asking him about how to improve your life. How did you get to this point? Which I don't think, honestly, I think actors are some of the people who I think they're too valued in our society. I don't think they should be the main people we should look up to, but still, that's what he asked these people, how to get to that certain area of life. I think he has some really great guests that offer some really deep knowledge on certain things. For that reason, we're going to put him in S tier. What the fuck? I don't know why the fuck I did that. Modern Wisdom, Andrew Huberman, great podcast. Nothing really to say wrong. I think Modern Wisdom, I think it's going to be the same thing as George Janko. If he sticks around, he's going to become one of the mainstays. If he already isn't a mainstay, I think it's a great thing. Great podcast. Slightly underrated, I think. Slightly underviewed compared to the other guys. Great podcast. Joe Rogan, what can I say more? I really like Joe Rogan podcasts. Some episodes I think are a lot weaker than others. because I think it's a lot more of the guest to be, let's say, entertaining or showing the real, the guest side and showing. I think it's much more of a, he's supposed to explore or unearth the guest and how they're like and how to get a real sense of who the guest is. And that's why there's no structure. It's purely, sort of quote unquote improvisational. And I think that's really great when the guest is good in that setting. But if he's not, then it can make a lot weaker of an episode. And I think you could see that case with the Rock episode, which, The Rock does well when there's some sort of a script, when there's some grand script, he does really well. When it's a little bit more improvisational, I think he's a lot weaker. For that reason, I think it's an A tier. Some of the best guests of all time. Alex Jones. What is this list? David Goggins, Alex Jones, Dana White, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders. What is this fucking list? Great list. Great people. Fucking Robert Downey Jr., Samuel L. Jackson. Some of the GOATs. You'll have a good time. This is some of the best stuff you'll ever hear. And it's the only opportunity to get a real sense for some of these people, because the other podcasts, the other interviews that they do, sometimes are a lot more scripted, or they're given something in advance, or they're edited. This is unedited, not scripted. Great. I think it's a great thing for humanity. So we're going to put him in A tier. Tate's speech, the emergency Among Us meeting. I think we'll put it in C tier. Plop it down in C tier. I like Tate. I think he's a funny guy. But, I don't agree on all of his takes. I think he's a little bit too much of a radical type guy. I think he's good as sort of, if you imagine him like as a funny guy, but if you imagine him as an actual person you want to look up to and be to, that's when it gets destructive. As a funny guy, as a sort of quote unquote comedian, a person you could laugh at, a sort of clown, you can look out, from the distance, saying some wild shit of, I think people, honestly, they take him fucking seriously with the vape shit. They take him seriously, when he said, oh, if you eat sushi, you're fucking gay, or some shit like that. Obviously, he doesn't think that. It's just an exaggerated version of what he thinks. And I think he's a comedian. That's what I think he is. His podcast is all right. It's the same shit. It's a comedian sort of thing. I think it's funny. That's about it. I'm putting it in C tier. What more can I say, my friends? What more can I say? This past weekend with Theo Von. I really like Theo Von. I think he has a really good personality, a really unique personality. His stories are great. He is generally, I think, a heartfelt guy. I think he's a very wholesome person. And I think he's a very honest person, which helps the podcast a lot. I think we're going to plop him up in the A tier. I think there's a couple things missing with his podcast. I don't really know exactly what. There's that something that doesn't make him as goated as the other ones. Maybe he's a bit younger than the other guys. Maybe he's a little bit on the podcast side. He's not been around as much. I think if he sticks around, once Joe Rogan, let's say, eventually, I'm not saying now, I'm not saying even in the the distant future, but one day the star is gonna fade away. Hopefully he doesn't become a Howard Stern where he does it for 50 years. Eventually it's gonna fade away. And that's, I think, when this past weekend by Theo Von can really take over and become the mainstay that the Joe Rogan experience is. Lex Friedman, another, I think, goated podcaster. I think another great podcaster. I think he has some of the best lineups of guests. Might even rival the guests of Joe Rogan. I think his questions are a lot deeper. You won't get a lot of the haha. You won't get a lot of the Family Guy funny moments. The funny moments that you will get from the other things. I don't think it's as easily clippable as the other ones. But it's still a great conversation that he has with these people. And you could, for some controversial people, you can really get a sense of what their psychology is and who they're like. I think he's going to interview Putin soon, and he's going to interview Zelensky soon. some other great leaders. I think he said Viktor Orban too. This is a great thing. We'll get a real opportunity to get a sense of their personality. I think it's a great thing. I really like this podcast. I think I'm going to put him in S tier. I don't really see anything wrong with it. I think we're going to put him right in between Andrew Huberman and Modern Wisdom. Nothing can say wrong. Great podcast. What can I say? What can I say more, my friends? The Tucker fucker, Carlson. I think we're going to plop him in, plop that shit in B tier. I think it's great. Some good, decent podcasts around there. I think the biggest one by far was the Putin one. I think, it's easier for us to say where we're not in the mixed or we're not, there to say, oh, yeah, some easy questions of Putin and everything like that. But, I mean, that's like you coming from your fucking Reddit armchair, sitting on your couch, sleeping in your bed, typing on your phone on X, typing on whatever comment section. Oh, you fucking ask easy questions, fucking scripted. Well, it's easier for you to say when you're not fucking face to face with a fucking tyrant from another country. I think it's good that we got something out of him. It's good to get at least a little sense of his psychology. Makes him understand him more, makes him humanize with him more, and might eventually bring some sort of a peace thing a little bit more. It's good relations. I think it's a good thing. B tier. Fresh and Fit, I think obviously D tier. What more can I say? This guy's claim to be some sort of a red pill thing for kids to follow. But we'll have whores from the fucking back streets of fucking Chicago, from the back streets of Miami. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is the most stupidest format of conversation podcast possible. Okay, so you have these two people. They're supposed to be these wholesome Christian, Muslim, people on their fucking grind type people. They surround themselves with 15 whores from the fucking back streets who probably don't have a very great education, my friends. They probably don't have a good family life either. They probably don't have a good relationship with their father or mother or with their family. People who are a little bit broken, who need some sort of a guidance in life, who potentially might not have the best takes. And then you'll put somebody there on the other side. It'll be a fucking Andrew Tate. It'll be a Charlie Kirk. It'll be a Sneeko. It'll be who else is there? I don't know. It'll be some of those. It'll be one of them. And these people on the other side who, the guest, the quote unquote real guest, will have these views, these very, traditional views that will be completely opposed to whatever these whores are saying, and also completely against a woman and stuff like that. Say, oh, women are bad drivers, but you won't have a fucking good woman, good role model there to argue that point. I think it's a ridiculous podcast. I think it's one of the worst podcasts, and I hope you don't listen to it, unless for the meme, of course. Obviously, go to podcast and talk to a podcast. I think I've not heard more, learned more than from this podcast. An amazing podcast. Ave Maria, straight into my ears. Beautiful podcast. Not just joking. And in reality, it's better than the fucking Fresh and Shit podcast. Fresh Shit podcast. Honestly, I'm a biggest hater, I think, of the fucking Fresh and Fit podcast. I'm sorry. It just makes no fucking sense. PBD. I like this guy, the Valuetainment guy. I think it's our right podcast. Good business tips. Shit like that. Pretty right wing. What more can I say? I was about to say some sort of whole speech and everything like that. I think it just is a decent podcast. I think there's a little shit missing for it to be at the top. Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent space. I think it's a bear over there. Pretty good. I think that's it. That's it for today, guys. What more can I say? Like and subscribe. Drop a like, drop a sub, and don't forget to drop your pants.